Before the temple was covered with gold, there stood a boy before God. He asked not for power, nor fame, nor victory. He asked for wisdom, and for a moment, heaven bowed before a pure heart. But all purity is eventually tested. There was a radiance in Jerusalem that outshone even the sun. The sound of hammers raising the temple mingled with the scent of spices brought by foreign kings. Solomon had become the wisest man on earth, and his voice echoed like divine decree. But the more the gold shone, the quieter God's presence became. Something within him was beginning to change, a barely perceptible sound, like a soul slowly cracking. The same man who once prayed for understanding now found himself surrounded by thrones, women, and foreign altars. Every conquest, every applause, every jewel that shone in his palace seemed to blind him to what truly mattered. This is how glory deceives. It begins as light, but ends as a mirror. And the man who once saw the invisible now saw only himself. Jerusalem had become a stage of splendor. The nations came to hear his wisdom, but few knew that within the king reigned a void. The temple was finished, its walls gleamed, but Solomon's heart was beginning to crumble. It is possible to build the house of God and lose the address of the soul. It is possible to be admired by all and forgotten within. He knew how to speak to kings, but he had forgotten how to hear God's silence. Perhaps this is the most tragic of all corruptions, when blessing becomes noise and prayer becomes mere memory. And it is in this discreet abyss that the wisest man on earth began to lose himself. There are times when success isn't a reward, it's a test. When everything goes right, that's when God observes whether the heart still knows how to kneel. How many of us, like Solomon, have confused gift with destiny and ended up turning it into a prison? Gold weighs when the spirit weakens. And so begins the story of a king who had everything and lost what was essential. The story of someone who learned that true wisdom is not knowing how to rule the world, but learning to remain small before God. Before the crown, there was only the sound of the wind blowing through the palace curtains and the memory of a father weeping before God. David left him not just a throne, he left an altar. Amidst harps and battles, the boy Solomon learned that power is born of repentance and that a king, before ruling the people, must learn to rule his own heart. When the halls still smelled of incense and sacrificial blood, he heard stories of a God choosing the unlikely. His father said, "It wasn't strength that brought me here, but mercy," and the boy believed. Perhaps that's why, when God asked him what he desired, he didn't ask for thrones or victories. He asked only for understanding. It was as if he had inherited not David's power, but his tears. Solomon's childhood was shaped by the sound of harps and the echo of prayers. He saw the scars of war in his father's face and the memory of error in his mother's. He learned early on that human glory is short, but forgiveness is long. This mixture of guilt and grace made him sensitive to the divine. He understood that God is not impressed by crowns, but draws near to those who still know how to weep. It was in this sensitivity that the call arose. God visited him in dreams, as if whispering in the recesses of consciousness. "Ask for whatever you wish, and I will give it to you," said the voice. The young man took a deep breath. He could have asked for anything, but he chose to ask for what would keep him dependent. "Give me wisdom." The answer came like a hot desert wind, a promise and a test at the same time. The gift that elevated him would also be the one that would test him. For wisdom is like fire. It illuminates, but it also burns, and few can withstand its brightness without becoming blinded. Solomon grew up believing that understanding life would be the same as understanding God, failing to realize that there are mysteries that are only revealed in silence. How often in youth do we confuse sensitivity with preparation? He wanted to understand everything, but some things can only be learned by falling. His mind was quick, but his heart was still a child. And while the people applauded him, the heavens watched, not with admiration, but with expectation. Perhaps the true calling is not to be heard by men, but to continue listening to God when the world begins to applaud. And this is where many of us stumble. When God's voice is mixed with the noise of approval, somewhere between the promise and the throne, the boy began to become king. And even as the throne elevated him, it also began to dig the abyss that would swallow him. Some say the calling is a gift, but in truth, it's a light burden that weighs heavier over time, because the more God trusts someone, the more silent he becomes. And in that silence, Solomon began to hear his own echo, the most dangerous sound for anyone who has ever heard heaven. Sometimes faith begins as music and ends as noise, and only those who have heard God's voice know the despair of no longer hearing it. There is an instant when purity meets pride, and from that encounter arises the conflict that will shape an entire life. What if your success is just a rehearsal for your downfall? The night in Gibeon was dense, and the air carried the scent of the newly lit altar. 1,000 burnt offerings rose in spirals of smoke, as if heaven were summoned to descend. Between the embers and the silence, a young king knelt. The crowd slept, but God did not. And it was there, amid the smoke of sacrifice and the solitude of royalty, that the Eternal decided to speak. "Ask for whatever you wish, and I will give it to you." The phrase pierced Solomon's sleep like a bolt of lightning cutting through time. For an instant, he felt the weight of eternity compressed into an invitation. Before him lay every possibility: power, wealth, glory, longevity. But what he chose would define not only his history, but the course of an entire nation. The young man took a deep breath, looked at the still burning altar, and remembered his father's calloused hands, which had always told him that the heart is a man's true throne. Then he replied, "Give your servant an understanding heart to judge his people and discern between good and evil." The sky fell silent. There was no thunder, no wind, no light, only a silence that seemed to smile. God was pleased. And he said, "Because you have not asked for riches, nor for the life of your enemies, but for understanding, I will give you wisdom, such as has never been before, nor will be again." In that instant, the air seemed to part. The same God who shapes the stars now shaped a man's mind. And Solomon awoke with something new pulsing within him, a lucidity that startled, a gift that weighed heavily. He saw the invisible in human intentions, the detail hidden in every gesture. And in judging, he saw more than facts. He saw hearts. But some gifts do not come alone. Every revelation carries a risk. Those who see too much run the risk of not being able to bear what they see. Wisdom, if not sustained by intimacy, becomes idolatry disguised as reason. And Solomon, still unaware, had asked for the gift that would make him both the most admired and the most vulnerable of kings. The following years tested him. Wisdom made him unusual, but also lonely. It's difficult to talk to people when you understand the pains of heaven, and it's dangerous to approach God when you begin to understand the human mind too much. The gift, which was once a bridge, could become a wall. Over time, people came from far and wide, kings, merchants, priests, to hear him speak. His every sentence seemed like an oracle. The words came out pure, precise, as if from the divine throne itself. But within him, something began to tremble. The more his wisdom grew, the more he felt the absence of its grantor. There are gifts that elevate us to test whether the heart can remain on its knees. Wisdom made him shine, but the shine began to distance him from the light. What about you? What would you ask for if God said to you, "Ask for whatever you wish"? Perhaps it's not the request that reveals who we are, but the reason behind it. The years passed, and Jerusalem became a reflection of heaven itself. Gold glittered on the gates, incense rose from the balconies, and the king's voice echoed like decree and prophecy. Solomon had become a living legend. No army dared face him, no court equaled his. The world came to him. Long caravans brought precious stones, spices, and stories of his wisdom. The city smelled of royalty and mystery. The palace was like a second temple, and the king a kind of priest of reason. He knew law, treaties, philosophy, music, and architecture. The wisdom he had sought had made him greater than all those around him, but also more distant. The people applauded him, the kings admired him, but few knew him. The Queen of Sheba arrived riding on camels covered in gold, bringing riddles and questions. And upon hearing Solomon's answers, she fell silent. "They haven't told me even the half," she said. His name spread across the deserts and seas like an unending song. But what men called glory, heaven called a trial, because there comes a point where success is no longer a blessing, it's a trap. The heart that once broke in prayer was now distracted by palaces, and the wisdom that had made it a servant began to make it a center. The moment when reverence becomes habit is subtle. Solomon still spoke of God, but he no longer listened to him. Mornings, once filled with searching, became routines. Nights, once filled with prayer, became meetings. The king's mind remained lucid, but his spirit was already asleep. The gift remained, but the voice that inspired it had departed. And perhaps this is one of the cruelest ironies of faith. God can allow the gift to continue, even when it no longer dwells in the heart. The temple's columns were still standing, but the altar within the man was already cracked. He preached the fear of God, but lived surrounded by ivory thrones and foreign wines. Gold reflected the world, but it no longer reflected heaven. Wisdom without intimacy is like fire without heat. It illuminates, but does not warm. Solomon understood everything, but no longer felt anything. The same man who understood the secret of the stars no longer understood the emptiness of the soul. And it was in this contrast that his reign reached its peak and began to tilt, because the top is where the wind blows the strongest, and the heart, if not anchored, begins to sway. Perhaps the greatest danger is not falling, but being applauded while turning away from God. How often does human approval mask divine absence? And how many of us still confuse blessing with permission? When everything surrounds you in brightness, the true test is whether your heart still remembers the darkness that formed it. The day of the temple's dedication dawned with clear skies and a vibrant air of anticipation. The people gathered around the altar, and the sound of trumpets echoed off the walls as if time itself had stood still. It was David's greatest dream realized by his son's hands. The king stood before the altar and prayed. His words rose like fire, and fire descended from heaven. The people shouted, the priests prostrated themselves, and the ground of Jerusalem shook. God dwelt among them. The presence was so intense that no one could remain standing. Solomon wept. In that moment, the king seemed more servant than monarch. The temple shone and heaven approved, but the same flame that descended to consume the sacrifice also ignited something deeper, the reminder that no human structure is capable of containing the eternal. The temple was a symbol, not a prison. The following years, however, were silent. The smoke of offerings had become routine, and the rituals an automatic reflex of lost devotion. The king, who had seen fire fall, now contented himself with ancient embers, and the temple, once the abode of glory, had become a monument to longing. Within the palace, other buildings began to emerge, not of stone, but of desire. Each political alliance brought a new wife, each wife a new altar, and each altar a new god. Thus, the wisest man on earth built his ruin with the same zeal with which he built the temple. The priests tried to warn him, but Solomon responded logically. All is wisdom, all is perspective. And so, discernment became justification. Sin, once named, was now explained, and by the time sin is explained, it has become a habit. The temple remained standing, but the king's heart was bent. God no longer descended in fire, but merely watched. There are silences that are not absence, but judgment. The same God who once answered with glory now spoke through the void. Solomon still ascended the altar, but his prayers seemed to echo off the walls. The man who knew the secret of ants and the heavens now no longer understood God's silence. And perhaps this is the height of the tragedy, when the wise man loses his wonder and the servant forgets the Lord. Those who have built a temple for God may end up erecting altars for themselves. And sometimes pride dons the cloak of devotion. Perhaps the true temple has no columns, no gold, no veil. Perhaps it is just a heart still willing to be set on fire. What if the fire that once descended upon the altar today needed to fall upon you? What would it find, faith or ashes? Idolatry never begins with statues. It begins with distractions. First, it's a thought that rises above God's voice. Then, it's a desire that gains more space than prayer. When Solomon began building altars to the gods of his foreign wives, he did so not out of rebellion, but out of diplomacy. He called wisdom what deep down was a fear of losing influence. Thus is born refined sin, that which masquerades as virtue. The man who once discerned the human heart now bargained with himself. He built temples to Ashtoreth and Moloch and called it tolerance. But each altar erected out of place was a crack within him. The wise king was beginning to fragment. His mind still shone, but his spirit was darkening. Idolatry is treacherous because it doesn't destroy all at once. It weakens gradually. Solomon still quoted Proverbs, still spoke of the fear of the Lord, but he no longer felt it. And the people, seeing the king, learned to separate wisdom from holiness. When the example falls, the nation stumbles along with it. Altars grew like shadows on the outskirts of Jerusalem. The same man who dedicated the temple to the living God now consecrated sacrifices to dead deities. It was the height of contradiction. The king who knew God's name and no longer spoke it with fear. And God, he remained silent. Not because he approves, but because judgment begins with the withdrawal of presence. When God is silent, the gift continues, but life loses its meaning. Solomon still knew what was right, but he no longer had the strength to choose. Perhaps the most dangerous idolatry is not that of external gods, but that of internal ideas. When the mind becomes the altar, there is no longer room for mystery. Man begins to worship his own understanding, and wisdom turns into pride. Some people imagine idolatry as the sin of the simple, but it is, in truth, the error of the wise. For only those who have known the true God can replace him with convincing arguments. And the more refined the intelligence, the more elegant the deception. Solomon had asked for discernment, but now he used it to justify what God called an abomination. And this is how the gift becomes a prison, when talent becomes an excuse for disobedience. In the silence of the throne, perhaps he still remembered the boy who once heard God's voice in Gibeon. And perhaps he realized that even surrounded by altars, he was alone. How many times have we also lost ourselves trying to balance faith with comfort, truth with applause, the altar with the mirror? Solomon's sin was not pleasure, it was substitution. He exchanged presence for the power to explain it. And when reason tries to take the place of faith, wisdom becomes idolatry by another name. There was a kind of silence in Jerusalem that not even the sound of harps could fill. The temple still shone, the banquets were still lavish, and the halls smelled of myrrh and wine, but the air was heavy. It was the weight of absence. The God who once answered with fire now answered with distance. Solomon walked among ivory columns and wondered, how could such a wise man feel so empty? The palace was vast, the throne was golden, but the sound of his own thoughts tormented him. Sometimes he tried to silence his discomfort with music, other times with philosophy. But emptiness cannot be explained, it only widens. God's silence is not a punishment, it's a response. When he is silent, it's because he's said enough. And it was in this silence that Solomon began to understand what gold could never buy: peace. He looked at the temple from a distance, and it was as if he were looking into his own heart, magnificent on the outside, but cold on the inside. The man who knew the secrets of creation now couldn't comprehend his own weariness. Everything he touched became a work of art, but nothing became rest. The luxury that surrounded him was a prison disguised as comfort. Every detail of royalty became a reminder of what he had lost. Even the throne, once a symbol of alliance, now seemed to him an empty altar. There is a kind of wealth that impoverishes the spirit. Because the more man tries to fill the void with the world, the deeper the abyss becomes. And the king who possessed everything began to desire only what he had once had, the simplicity of hearing God speak. The people still admired him, but heaven was already watching him in silence. And perhaps that was the most appropriate punishment, to be left alone with his own wisdom. On long nights, he remembered when the fire descended, when the altar responded, when the presence was so real his knees trembled. Now, neither incense nor words could break the emptiness. God's silence was like a mirror. It showed all that man had become without him. How many of us still confuse God's silence with the end of his grace? Sometimes he is silent, not because he has given up, but because he wants to show us the noise we create around our hearts. Solomon began to realize that the greatest punishment was not to lose the throne, but to continue reigning senselessly. Wisdom had made him great, but only presence made him alive. And when the presence was gone, the whole world became too small to fit inside him. In the end, luxury became a memory, and the throne a warning. Because there is no glory that can replace peace, and perhaps God still speaks, not in voice, but in emptiness. The chill of the early morning began to invade the palace halls. The king, who once walked on flights of wisdom, now walked among inner shadows. He knew something needed to be confronted, not in the nations, but within himself. On a silent night, Solomon sat on the stone floor of the temple, not as a monarch, but as a son. He remembered the day the fire descended, when the trumpets fell silent, and he wept before the presence. Now he wept for the absences, not for thrones, but for the soul. He spoke, "O living God, I have lost myself in reflection. I have built walls to hide my wounds. I have erected altars to erase my emptiness. Allow me now to return to the stripping away." These words fell like light rain in the darkness, and when silence answered, he realized repentance is not just running from what is wrong, but running back to the one who has always been faithful. And he fell to his knees, not crying out for privilege, but for restoration. At that moment his wounded heart began to beat again. The voice that had been silent within him took shape, a gentle remedy for an old wound. He didn't ask for an extraordinary miracle, just a quiet new beginning. The king who once spoke to the people now spoke to the Father. He confessed not only the altar he had erected, but the altar he had built within himself. He wanted to renounce not only external idols, but also those he had allowed to arise in his mind and emotions. And God, in mysterious ways, he began to respond, not with falling fire, but with abiding peace. The emptiness began to quiet. Words began to carry weight again. Wisdom was once again a servant, not a tyrant. In this reunion, Solomon revisited the boy who asked for wisdom at Gibeon. He didn't want the gift to kill him. He wanted it to return him to its true source. He understood that wisdom without humility was ruin. There comes a moment when man realizes that he cannot be rebuilt with gold, but with tears, and that the sweetest fragrance that rises to the throne of God is that of broken trust. Leave in the comments what this part awakens in you. It is possible that when you confess before God, you also express something that you have been keeping inside. Solomon's final days were different from the splendor that marked his beginning. There was no longer so much gold, nor so many parties. The palace seemed too large for the silence that inhabited it. He spent hours gazing at the horizon, where the sun set over the temple he had built, the same temple that now symbolized more regret than victory. He still wrote, and what came from his pen were no longer decrees but outpourings. The man who once explained the world was now trying to understand himself. "All is vanity," he wrote, and each word felt like a confession. It wasn't cynicism, it was lucidity. He understood, finally, that everything that shines too brightly tires the eye, and that true light is that which does not dazzle. The wisdom he once sought, he now used to recognize his own limits. He learned that wealth doesn't buy forgiveness, and that power doesn't protect the spirit. And perhaps this is Solomon's greatest legacy, proving that even the wisest man must learn to be small. In his old age, he spoke less and listened more. And the silence, which had once frightened him, now healed him. The absence of answers had become the purest form of faith. He discovered that God doesn't always need to speak when the heart already understands. The temple still stood, but the throne had become a symbol of fragility. And yet the repentant king found peace. The presence that had withdrawn had returned, not with thunder, but with comfort. It was grace returning to the place it should never have left. He looked out at the gardens where the wind blew through the leaves and smiled. Man was not made to possess, but to belong, he thought. And in that simplicity, he found what he had been searching for. Time would erase his gold, but not his words. Centuries later, they would still echo on the lips of those seeking meaning amidst the noise of the world. Because a king's mistakes can become mirrors for an entire generation. There are lessons that only come from falling, and there are regrets that are worth more than crowns. Solomon discovered that the end is not when God is silent, it is when man stops listening. And perhaps this is the message that runs through the centuries. True wisdom is not understanding everything, but continuing to seek even after failing. Tell me what that part made you think. Sometimes what is born silently in one heart can spark hope in another.